So this channel's just started, and I'm already getting requests on things that people want to see, and I've already gotten a couple of people asking me for, well, advice on how a carburetor works. So I actually just literally got this one in the mail. I grabbed the package from the front porch, opened it up, I was like, what the heck is this? And I was like, oh yeah, it's that little carburetor for that engine I'm working on, video coming soon. And I figure before I go strapping this thing onto that engine, let's go ahead and look at what it is that we're looking at here. So a carburetor essentially serves two different functions for your engine. It gives it air and fuel, and it more or less regulates air and fuel going into the engine, and we're going to go ahead and cover it in two little bits. So obviously this right here is a small carburetor for a small engine. We're going to cover a larger car's carburetor, which pretty much operates the same, but it is a little bit different and it looks different, and it makes people kind of scratch their head, unsure what they're looking at, because it's not exactly identical to something like this. So we're going to go ahead and cover a car's carburetor in a later video. Right now we're just going to focus on this little tiny one right here. So we're going to go ahead and talk about how it gets fuel to the engine, and then we'll talk about how it gets air to the engine. Actually, you know what? Reverse that. We're going to talk about how it gets air to the engine, and then we'll talk about fuel, because the fuel kind of relies on the air. So if you have your carburetor, it's going to be sitting on your engine, probably looking something like this. My hand's the engine block, so it's going to be sitting on there, probably looking something like this. This right here is the bowl of the carburetor where the fuel sits, and so the bowl's always going to be on the bottom of the engine if you don't know what orientation to put this thing onto your engine. So there's going to be oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes two different, I'm going to try to explain this like I'm talking to a 5-year-old, two different flaps on your carburetor. There's going to be a choke, and there's going to be a throttle. Your choke is going to be the one that is up front and first coming in contact with the air, and what it does is exactly what the name entails. It chokes the amount of air that your carburetor gets, and that in turn dictates whether or not it gets more fuel. And we'll talk about that as we go into our throttle. So right here, this is our main flap. It's going to be the one that is nearest towards the engine, and that is going to be your throttle. There's this little gate right here, this little flap that determines how much air your engine is going to be getting based off of how open it is. Obviously closed, that's not very much air, but if we open that up, it's going to be getting a whole lot of air. As the engine is sucking air from the carburetor, it's going to be pulling air from this bowl that is currently filled with fuel. We'll talk about how that works here in a second. But it's going to be sucking air from this bowl and pulling it into the carburetor as an air-fuel mixture. If you were to, say, I don't know, go to the beach on a really windy day and you see the wind slapping against the top of the water, and you see how a little bit of water vapor is picked up as the wind slaps on top of it, that's essentially what your carburetor's doing. It's a little bit more in-depth than that, but for the people who don't know how these things work, I think that's the easiest way to be able to visualize that. So, as the air is pulled through from the carburetor from a vacuum created by the engine, we'll talk about how engines make vacuums and how engines actually work probably in another video. But as the engine piston moves down inside the engine, it creates a vacuum that pulls air through the carburetor because it's pulling air through the intake of the engine. And that air pulls fuel from our fuel bowl right here and through our throttle, and determining what position your throttle's in, that's going to determine how much air and fuel goes into your engine and how much it revs up. So that's the easiest way that I can think to explain how one of these right here works in terms of air power. If you want, I'll say, less air going into your carburetor, you have this choke right here, which is going to be more or less set. You're probably going to have something on your engine that is going to allow you to set the choke. And what your choke is going to be set to is going to oftentimes determine how much air and fuel you get without manipulating your throttle. Like, for example, if you are, say, giving your engine a high throttle, but you have a choke on, it's not going to be getting very much air. You can see this little tiny hole right there that's going to allow some air to pass through, But if you want to go ahead and turn your choke off so you get a full amount of air into your carburetor, and then you have your throttle open, now your carburetor is officially wide open and your engine is getting as much air as possible. I guess it could get more air if you were to remove the carburetor and set something up like that, but that's probably a topic for another video. So as far as the fuel works inside of one of these, you're going to have some sort of inlet for your fuel. It's probably going to be located somewhere around your carburetor bowl. Not always, but pretty much always. So you set your fuel line up to your carburetor. If it's a small engine like this, it's probably not going to have a fuel pump or anything like that. You're probably going to have a fuel tank that's above the carburetor, so gravity pulls fuel down and fills the bowl. That's not exactly a problem for a small carburetor like this, but that's not something that you can get away with like a car's engine or something like that, just because those take a lot more fuel. So gravity's pulling fuel down into our little fuel inlet, and this fuel inlet is just filling up this bowl. Inside of this is a little floater, kind of like how people have on the back of their toilet. As that floater floats up on top of that fuel level, it's going to reach a point to where it shuts off a valve inside of the carburetor. Kind of like how once your floater inside your toilet fills up, the toilet bowl stops filling up until you flush it, then it goes back down. So as this bowl is filled up, as the air flowing through the carburetor pulls fuel from that bowl, that fuel level goes down. It reaches a certain point and more fuel is fed into that bowl to fill it back up until that floater once again reaches the top. And that more or less is how a carburetor works, but a lot of people are oftentimes concerned and confused about all of the little screws and all of the other extra tidbits and pieces that are on a carburetor. And those are pretty simple. You gotta kind of look up what carburetor it is that you have, and that will kind of explain what's going on with your particular things. But for the most part, for these smaller carburetors, it's pretty gosh darn easy. They more or less are, what's the word I'm looking for here? They're ways to set your fuel for your carburetor consistently? Is that the word I'm looking for? It's a good way to be able to set the amount of fuel that your carburetor gets without having to get hands-on with the carburetor. Like, for example, if you want to adjust the choke, you're probably going to have to do something on your engine to be able to adjust that choke to whatever the engine is currently requiring. Or if you want to rev up the engine, you got to adjust your throttle right here to whatever it is wanting to adjust itself to. However, if you want to, say, have your engine just idling, then you don't want to have to mess with choke or throttle or anything like that once the engine is to the point to where it can idle because it's warmed up, etc., etc. And so to set the amount of fuel that the engine is getting without it getting too much or too little fuel, that's what a lot of these screws are for. They're ways to set, say, jets inside your carburetor to determine how much fuel is sprayed as your carburetor is running. Let's use this one right here as an example. This screw right here, I get that it's one of many. This screw right here is used to set how much fuel your carburetor is going to get while it is in idle. And it does that very simply. This screw, it pops in through this side of the body of the carburetor and comes out this side. And as that screw pokes through the carburetor in this direction, it's going to determine how far this little what are we going to call this? We're going to call it a latch. How far this little latch right here can move, and that's going to determine how far our little panel on the inside of the carburetor can actually close. You'll notice that as we close this thing, see if I can get good lighting here, as we close this thing, we have this little panel right here that's going to rest on that screw, and so the more that is screwed in, the less this is going to close. And so if it is, say, screwed in to the point to where it is open like that, and you can very clearly see the gap right there, then we're going to be getting more air into our engine in comparison to, say, if we had the screw unscrewed. Now we would be getting significantly less air. Now, of course, we can adjust our throttle to basically get whatever amount of air that we want, but if we want the engine just sitting there in idle, this right here is a good way to be able to adjust how fast your engine is going to be revving in idle without you having to touch it. And that's kind of what this screw right here is for. So, like I said, you got to kind of look up what your particular carburetor is. Like, there's certain carburetors out there that don't have jet adjustments or anything like what I have on this one. This is more or less a fancier model. There's even carburetors out there that don't even have a choke on them. If you only have like one of these little panels on your carburetor, then that's going to be a throttle, and your carburetor does not have a choke on it. And as a result of that, you don't have to worry about what setting to put your choke in. Personally, I don't necessarily mess with the choke unless I absolutely have to. This is one of those things that I consider to be a bonus feature on a carburetor. If you have an engine that's been sitting for a while and maybe is gummed up or, I don't know, worn out or something like that, that's where a choke comes in. But like I said, for the most part, I don't really mess with that. I can get away with a good number of other ways to be able to start a starting engine, which we might even make videos of down the road. But very, very simple concepts. Just to reiterate how this thing works: bowl fills with fuel, air flows through carburetor, picks up fuel from bowl, puts it into the engine. These flaps determine how much air and fuel that engine is going to be getting, and all the little screws on this thing are how you adjust your jets based off of what sort of settings you want with your particular carburetor to be able to have it idle or get X amount of fuel for X amount of air coming through it. So I think that's pretty much it. This right here is not something you see very often. This is actually a drain plug for our bowl right here. So if you put the engine away for any real length of time, you can pull this drain plug, old fuel comes out. This way you don't have fuel sitting inside your carburetor for 20 years and turning into varnish. So I hope that this explanation helped some people understand at least a little bit about how a carburetor works. They're actually extraordinarily simple. Realistically, I don't think that I have anything else that I can add here. We're gonna have to go get ourselves a larger, say, car's carburetor to look at that. Like, there's certain things on like a larger vehicle that maybe has a distributor with a vacuum advance that you gotta hook up to your carburetor for the manifold vacuum so you get proper advancing. And there's certain things that go into a more complex carburetor, but these small ones right here, these are quite simple, quite easy. So thanks for watching. I appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share, and I suppose I'll see you on the next video.